Hi, this is Laura Wilkins with the Floyd County Library, and we are so glad for you to join us today for the next session in our Being Human Humanities talk series presented in partnership with Jefferson Community and Technical College. We are continuing on our theme of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Last month, we had talks on the theme of famine, and this month, we have talks on the theme of pestilence. We are joined by Brenda Edgar, Associate Professor of Fine Art, and Amy Stewart, Professor of Fine Art. So thank you so much to Brenda and Amy for joining us today. They will both be doing talks relating to Matthias Grunewald's Isenheim Altarpiece. So looking so much forward to that. And of course, I'm such a big fan of art history and remember studying this piece in an art history class. So definitely looking forward to these talks today. Quick reminder, our next Being Human series will be on November 19th, continuing again on that Four Horsemen theme. And the theme of those talks will be war. So mark your calendar for Thursday, November 19th, 6:30 p.m. And join us then. So with that, thank you to Brenda and thank you to Amy. And I will stop sharing my screen, and Brenda, we will head over to you. Thanks.
Okay, excuse me. All right, bear with me for a moment while I reteach myself share screen. And here we are. So, okay, how does that look? Can you guys see that?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So this is really going to be cool for me and for Amy because I typically teach ancient through medieval art history, and she typically teaches Renaissance through modern. So this gives us a chance to kind of, really show the same piece of art from both perspectives. So what came before it, and then what did it influence that came later. So I'm taking the earlier part of the story, being the medievalist that I am. The title of my talk is borrowed from a Metallica song, so pardon that. It is called Leper Messiah, but it's a really, really fitting title, and you'll see why. We're going to be looking at the diseased Christ figure as an iconographic motif before the Isenheim Altarpiece. So what you're looking at in the slide that's showing right now is a view of the Isenheim Altarpiece itself. So this is what all the fuss is about. If you've never seen the Isenheim Altarpiece before, this is it. And we're going to look at it in much more detail, of course. But this is the way it's displayed today. It is not in its original location anymore. Excuse me, it is a masterpiece of German Renaissance art dating to the early 16th century. And it's a very complicated, multi-layered altarpiece. It's called a polyptych, meaning that it has many panels. And it is actually disassembled. So they have separated the three layers of the polyptych from one another. And as you can see there in that photograph, which I just got from Wikipedia, that's how you see it today. And the benefit of that is that you can see all of the panels all of the time. And later on, we'll get into why that wasn't the case when it was all together. So it has been moved from its original location, which was, importantly, the chapel of St. Anthony's Hospital in Isenheim, which is in France today. It has been moved to the Musée des Unterlinden in Colmar, which is also today in France. Because the border between Germany and France shifts around all the time. Both of those places used to be in Germany, now they're in France. The most compelling and influential scene in the altarpiece is the crucifixion, which is the one that you can see here displayed most prominently, as it displays the body of Christ thoroughly riddled with open lesions and having grotesquely contorted hands and feet. To understand why Grunewald would depict his Christ this way, we need to investigate the history of diseased Christ iconography as well as the painting's original setting in a hospital that specialized in treating ergotism, which is a horrific and deadly skin disease. Let's begin with a closer look at the basic structure and iconography of this famous polyptych. Amy will talk a whole lot more about the altarpiece format, but just to give you an overview, this is the deepest level of the polyptych, and it features a bunch of scenes about St. Anthony Abbot. On the left panel, he is visiting Paul the Hermit, the only man in the world who was older and holier than him. And on the right-hand panel, we have the Temptation of St. Anthony, which we'll revisit with in a little while. And then in the center shrine, those are gilded and painted statues by Nicholas Hagenau. And they show Saints Augustine, Anthony Abbot in the middle, and Jerome. And then on the bottom, on the what we call the predella, that bottom piece there, the sculptures depict Jesus with the apostles. Now this is the interior. So this down the center here is a split. There are two separate panels there, and they can actually be opened up. Okay, so imagine if you opened those two panels, you would see what we just saw. That was the deepest level. This is the interior, and it's covered with very bright and vivid paintings. So the Annunciation, an angelic choir, a nativity scene, and a resurrection. And then on the bottom, on the predella, is the entombment. And then this, if you close the panels over that stuff, this is what you see on the exterior. So the exterior is very, very dark and somber. The predella panel is the same for both exterior and interior. Left to right here, we have St. Sebastian, crucifixion, of course, and then St. Anthony Abbot again. So the question that we're asking is, how did we get to such a gruesome, graphic crucifixion and deposition scene as well? Christ's body on the cross, as well as down below when they're getting ready to entomb him, are covered in sores and very, very torturous and uncomfortable to look at. So why? Why would you show the scene that way? Well, let's just spend a second looking at how the crucifix evolved throughout the Middle Ages, because it did not stay the same. I'm calling it from triumph to torture. If you look at the 9th century version, Christ is clothed. He is stylized, very sort of flattened, weightless. His body is intact. And he looks like an immortal creature. He does not appear to be subject to the laws of physics or gravity. He is a triumphant figure in those early crucifixes. The Altonian Jarrow cross in the middle was a major milestone in art. It was the first life-size crucifix and the first one to show Christ obviously dead. And that was a major transition that was very, very influential into the Gothic period, which is where we are on the right there. The Gothic Crucifixus Dolorosus, or Crucifix of Sorrows, is going to be my main focus for this talk as the ancestor of Grunewald's Christ. And the Crucifixus Dolorosus emerged as part of a new form of spirituality that developed in the 14th century in Europe. At this time, the faithful cultivated intimate individual relationships and experiences with the divine, sometimes of a mystical nature. In addition, a cultural shift toward focus on the physically and emotionally human dimensions of Christ, rather than only his divinity, affected many aspects of religious art. Another new art form that came from the new spirituality was the Andachtsbild, or a smallish image for aid in private devotion. Andachtsbilder feature poignant vignettes isolated from larger narratives to invite emotional responses to the iconography. Some Andachtsbilder are sweet and beautiful, like the one on the left showing St. John and Jesus. These are meant to elicit feelings of agape, the highest form of love, from the viewer. Many of them hit a more sorrowful note, however, depicting holy figures in a state of agony, like the one on the right. These figures were meant to induce feelings of sadness and suffering in the viewer, as well as compassion. Such feelings were considered good for the soul and pleasing to God. We use the German name for these images because they originated in Germany in the 14th century. One especially popular type of Andachtsbild was called a Vesperbild. Vespers were evening prayers, and these scenes were meant to aid the faithful in achieving feelings of compassion and empathy as they knelt for worship by candlelight at bedtime. Vesper builders show the Virgin Mary mourning over the dead body of her son. Many were meant to be as grotesque and disturbing as possible to elicit the desired response. This German iconographic phenomenon would spread southward over the course of the 14th century. And this is what would become of that subject matter as it spread. It evolves, and there's a French version there on the left. And then in Italy, the Vesper-built scene became known as the Pietà, which is Italian for pity. And of course, Michelangelo's treatment is the most famous example. It is marked by great emotional restraint in stark contrast to its Gothic ancestor, which was very charged with pathos. But let's get back to the 14th century. Oh, that's better. So these are just a few of the Crucifixi Dolorosi, crucifixes of sorrows, in Cologne, Germany. There are many, many of these things, and they are found all over Europe and even beyond, but nowhere in as great a concentration as in Cologne. Here in these examples, we can see that many examples are covered in sculpted and or painted lesions. Until fairly recently, it was believed, written, and taught that Crucifixi Dolorosi, like Vesper Builder, were first created in Germany. This is in part due to how many of them were made there and are still there today, but it is also because the early days of art history coincided with a period of zealous nationalism and cultural chauvinism in Germany. So German art historians claimed the Crucifixus Dolorosus, which they called the Pestkreuz, or plague cross. We'll talk more about that in a second. But they claimed it for Germany. They claimed it as a unique embodiment of the passionate and rather dark German national temperament. They were seen as a truly native German phenomenon that eventually spread far and wide. And that's what I was taught as an undergraduate. But recent scholarship has corrected this view. The origin of the Crucifixus Dolorosus is now traced to the work of Giovanni Pisano in Italy at the turn of the 14th century, and it spread outward from there. Which is the more usual order of things in art history. So these earliest Italian examples by Pisano do not have the terrifying open wounds. So that, maybe was the German addition to the genre, but it is Italian by birth. As the Crucifixus Dolorosus type spread throughout Europe, regional variations developed on the popular theme. So I could have chosen any number, of different examples, but these are kind of a sampling. So there's one of the ones from Cologne, brought that one back, and then there's one that's in the Czech Republic, the Jilava crucifix, and the one on the right is in the National Museum of Poland in Warsaw. And the Czech ones tend to be, gosh, they almost look like they could have been done in the 20th century, very abstracted and kind of brutal. And the Polish ones really focus on coagulating wounds and lots of blood and gore. Check out the side wound over there. A lot of effort put into that, making it as gruesome as possible. Okay, so why did the Crucifixi Dolorosi show Jesus covered with wounds? We still don't really have an answer to why anybody would show him that way. So there's a couple ways to look at it. One thing to consider is the phenomenon known as flagellation, which is basically whipping. As a part of his passion, Jesus was tied to a pillar and whipped. Some Crucifixi Dolorosi, like the one on the left, have wounds that resemble lashes from a barbed scourge. Look over here on the right, I've given you a couple of examples of scenes from the Middle Ages showing what that flagellation looks like. And so the one on the right is Italian and is woundless, but pretty famous, by Cimabue. This one over here from the French Book of Hours, though, is more helpful for us because we can see those wounds, which are real similar to the wounds on this Crucifixus dolorosus, which is one of my favorites because if you notice, it has a wig instead of sculpted hair, and its face, which you can't really see too well here, is really well done, very nice and disturbing. So these wounds could also allude to the spectacle called self-flagellation, which was a devotional practice of the time, in which religious zealots called flagellants publicly whipped themselves in empathy with Christ's pain. This was done especially at times of crisis, such as during the Black Death pandemic. And you can see that on the bottom right. The Crucifixi Dolorosi provided an alternate, less extreme way for viewers to participate in Christ's pain for their spiritual welfare. Another thing that we have to consider when we look at these sore-covered bodies is leprosy. Although these crucifixes were until recently called Pestkreuze or plague crosses, in the art historical literature, they are in fact not meant to show the effects of the Black Death, which was usually shown in art by the presence of a single bubo or an infected and swollen lymph node. Rather, a body evenly covered with red and or raised sores, like the one on the left, was visual shorthand for leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease. Leprosy is a bacterial infection that results in physical disfiguration and usually forcible alienation from society. The body sores shown in art don't bear much resemblance to the actual appearance of leprous lesions, but most people wouldn't ever have gotten close enough to a leper to know. It was simply a convention that was universally understood. Leprosy reached epidemic proportions in Europe, peaking in the 14th century, right at the same time the Crucifixi Dolorosi were created. It is clear that many of these Christs were depicted as leper messiahs who bore the pain of the very disease that most terrified the people who prayed before them. So in those right-hand images, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. That's just how you show leprosy, regardless of its correctness, medical correctness. And then another layer of meaning to why would you want to show Christ suffering so is the theology of suffering and redemption. Crucifixi Dolorosi were meant to shock and disturb with their graphic depictions of the pain of leprous symptoms and or torturous scourging. Remember that the function of most devotional art at the time was to stir up sadness and compassion in the viewer. At the same time, the faithful could take comfort knowing that Christ understands their fear, their pain, and their suffering, and he takes it all on his shoulders for the benefit of his followers. He has not abandoned you, the sculptures say. The key is to endure bodily suffering with Christ-like patience and look forward to the spiritual benefits it will reap in the hereafter. And this selection of images I just chose for their pathos. These are really torturous images that are meant to upset. So here's the crucifixion scene from Isenheim in the middle here. And now you can see clearly that we could think of it as the last great Crucifixus Dolorosus. I brought back in one of the ones from Cologne there on the left, just so you can see side by side how similar they are. Christ's body takes on the same gaunt, diseased appearance as in those Gothic sculptures. But here, its appearance and meaning is tailored to a specific context. The chapel of the Hospital of St. Anthony, which was dedicated to the treatment of ergotism. Just as the sculpted Christs took on the burden of leprosy, Grunewald's painted Christ bears a special pain specific to the patients at the hospital. In addition, the Isenheim resurrection scene, seen on the right there, which is from the interior of the altarpiece, shows the risen Christ, almost dissolving in bright gold light, his hideous wounds congealed into shining red jewels. This vision of restored integrity in the afterlife would have been medicine for the troubled souls of the unfortunate hospital patients. It was a promise that was implied by the Crucifixi Dolorosi, but here it is actually depicted coming true. The Isenheim entombment scene, which we see down below here, broken into two parts on the predella. It is the spiritual descendant of a Gothic Vesper build, like the one on the left, which shows Christ's body with the same lesions we see on the Isenheim Christ. Grunewald's treatment of this scene is again meant to resonate with his very specific audience. The split in the middle of the predella, where the two parts at one time slid apart to reveal that gilded sculpture behind him, would have reminded viewers of the frequent amputations performed at this hospital. And manuals from the time tell us that these amputations took place below the knee. Although it was performed without anesthesia, nevertheless, the Antonine monks were experienced and skilled at amputation. So again, this sort of split here in the predella would have reminded the audience of that. The monks there had a habit of literally hanging up the amputated limbs in the chapel as votive offerings to St. Anthony. And you can see some of those in the woodcut over here to the right. Notice also St. Anthony's usual attributes, which are all here. He has a tau cross on his staff, a T-shaped cross, and also on his lapel here. The fire, painted in red, is symbolic of the burning pain of skin diseases. And he has almost always a pig, which is right down here in the front. According to legend, he miraculously healed a pig, and so it sort of followed him around like a pet. As we have said, the scourge faced by viewers of the Isenheim Altarpiece was not leprosy, but ergotism, then called St. Anthony's fire, an infection that we now know is caused by a fungus that grows on rye. It causes open, weeping skin lesions and disfiguring muscle contractions of the limbs. The final stages of the illness involve convulsions, hallucinations, and death. The chemical composition of ergo is similar to that of LSD. So it involves some pretty hardcore dementia symptoms. With medicine still in its infancy, the role of the hospital at this time was not primarily to cure illness, because that rarely ever happened back then. Rather, the monks that staffed the hospital tried their best to ease the patient's symptoms by using herbal medicines, salves, and balms, and even more importantly, tended to their spiritual health by holding masses and prayer services at all the canonical hours. The sickest patients were given beds in the chapel, where the altarpiece would have been visible to them at all times. Having given up hope for the recovery of their bodies, patients were encouraged to focus on their reward in heaven. The Isenheim Temptation of St. Anthony, which we'll see again in a second, features a demonic figure, seen down here in this detail, who bears all the signs of being in the last throes of ergotism. The condition of Christ's skin in the crucifixion mimics the effects of the disease, while his mangled feet and hands resemble its painful contractions. So here's the interior, the deepest level, rather, of the polyptych that shows us all the St. Anthony scenes. St. Anthony is featured so much on the Isenheim Altarpiece because he was the patron saint of the hospital where it was painted for, and he was also the patron saint of ergotism, which was the disease they specialized in. So St. Anthony Abbot appears a total of 4 times on the Isenheim Altarpiece. He actually appears once on the exterior, which is image number 1, holding a tau cross as he looks on the crucifixion scene. The second one takes us to that innermost shrine, and in that sculpture he is enthroned between Saints Augustine and Jerome, who are also church fathers with ties to the Antonine order. The third image shows you on the left innermost panel where we see Anthony on his famous visit to the hermit Paul, the only man in the world older and holier than him. And so the significance of that is that these two men who have been lucky enough to survive into old age, more or less intact, converse amidst these very precisely painted medicinal plants that were used as part of the hospital's treatment plan. So they sort of stand for the wish, you know, of all of these patients that would be looking at the piece. You know, that's the goal, is to become an old holy man. And the hospital is doing the best that they can by providing what was then state-of-the-art medication. And then finally, in the fourth one, the right innermost panel, that shows us the temptation of St. Anthony. So in that circle is the demon that we saw in the previous slide. St. Anthony himself is this large figure in blue in the middle. And you can see him being tortured by these very nightmarish devils. Here's a close-up. So there he is in the middle being tortured. And actually, we call it a temptation, but it is better understood as the torment or the torture of St. Anthony. In this scene on the innermost level, Anthony is beset by surreal devils and demons. And this painting, of course, was an important influence on surrealists in the 20th century. These hallucinations that he's being tortured by simulate the ones that ergotism patients would have suffered. So the idea is that patients would pray before this altarpiece that they, like Anthony, could withstand the torturous symptoms they were experiencing without losing their faith. And then finally, we also get to meet Saint Sebastian on Isenheim. He appears on the exterior because of his association with plague and other diseases. His life contains a famous scene where he is shot full of arrows for being Christian. Amazingly, this did not kill him. He was nursed back to health by Saint Irene, but ultimately was clubbed to death by order of the Roman emperor. In Grunewald's painting of him, he is shot through with several arrows. Like Christ bears the wounds of ergotism and Anthony endures devilish visions, Sebastian stands as a symbol of spiritual triumph over bodily challenges. In the German woodcut to the left, the arrow scene is again featured, and the prayer below it calls upon Sebastian for protection against plague. At the hospital in Isenheim, Sebastian would have been invoked for protection and deliverance from the deadly disease that plagued its patients. And now, for something completely different, Dr. Amy Stewart is going to talk about the afterlife of the Isenheim Altarpiece. And so I am going to stop sharing. And I believe I have stopped sharing. Have I stopped sharing?
Yes,
Amy?
you
Yes.
are.
Okay.
And I'm trying to share my screen. Let me see. Here we
Button
go.
on the bottom with the green arrow. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Do I need to click anything else?
Just go into the slideshow view. It looks good to me.
Okay. Let me get to my slideshow here. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start. Brenda, thank you for that. When we talked about this, I actually wanted to do the Isenheim too when Brenda put out her call for talks, and she said, well, I want to do it, so what else can we do? And I had remember being very intrigued by Otto Dix's painting The War, which is references the Isenheim Altarpiece. And so I came up with the title of Otto Dix The War, Art About a Modern Man-Made Pestilence. So we're going to be drawing back on the themes that Dix picks up from the Isenheim and a few other altarpieces I think he references as well. So like Brenda's presentation, this will have many layers, but not in the altarpiece itself. It will have layers reaching back to art history in the mind of Otto Dix, who draws upon these tools and references I think that many people, particularly in Germany during the First World War, would have known and understood. So we will begin with his piece. So this is his altarpiece, and you can see right away it is in a similar format to the image Brenda put out with the altarpiece. It has two side wings with a main panel, and then it does have a predella down here at the bottom. Another thing I want to point out is that Dix was very interested in how the old masters made their paintings. So while this was done in 1932, Dix is using oil on wood, and he's using old master techniques, and we'll talk more about that, which is unusual for the time. There were other artists that he was collaborating with and painting with that kind of called him out for using art painting methods of the past, which I think is also very interesting. So he's trying not only to reference the images and the form of the altarpiece, but also the painting techniques as well. So he draws heavily Dix's altarpiece, and we can see the two side by side on the format of the altarpiece in general, and of Isenheim in particular. So we're going to go back a little bit and just talk about the format of the altarpiece and the form of it, and what its meaning was in the Middle Ages, and why this is important for Dix. So you can see the panels on either side here, mirrored over here, as well as the predella here, and then the central panel. And we'll talk about what Dix does. So I'm taking you back in time to about 1308, a very famous altarpiece, Duccio's Maestà. But I want to not only talk about the form. Brenda mentioned the idea of the altarpiece as a polyptych, many paneled, and Duccio's is very famous. It has lots of images on the front and a big centerpiece of the Maestà, which means Mary enthroned. We see her here, and lots of saints and other figures here, but I also don't have a picture or image of the back, but the back was also covered with lots of little scenes from the life of Christ. And as the altarpiece went out of fashion, a lot of those were removed and sold, so they're now all over the world. But Duccio's Maestà has some similarities to the Isenheim. This one was commissioned by the city of Siena in Italy. And Siena, we think of medieval and Renaissance, early Renaissance Italy as really being Florence and Rome. But Siena was a very wealthy city at the time because of the pilgrimage, where people would come from all over Europe and go to Rome on a pilgrimage, and they would stop in Siena and leave all their wealthy goods in the bank. And the bank would, in Siena, and the bank would claim interest on it. So Siena became very, very wealthy. There was also a silver mine there as well. So as they became wealthy in about 1308, they decided they needed a new, very large altarpiece, and they dedicated it to Mary. And it replaced an older miracle-working altarpiece. So the original altarpiece that was there was created on the belief that the Virgin Mary had saved the city from the Florentines in a battle, a very famous one from 1260. And the remnants of this battle and the saving of the city by prayers to the Virgin, by all members of the city, was really important. So important that when the altarpiece was completed by Duccio, the artist, it was processed through the city. Everyone was given a day off to go and see the procession. The poor of the city received alms, and prayers were given to the Virgin to preserve the city from misfortune, traitor, or enemy. And one of the things that was beginning to impact Siena was the Black Death. And unfortunately, Siena lost about half of its population due to the Black Death, and never regained its stature in the Renaissance the way Florence and Rome did. And then we're going to move forward to another altarpiece. This is the Bayeux altarpiece, and it has a Last Judgment. And this one is a apocalyptic as well. And you can see the Last Judgment here with the risen Christ and Archangel Michael, and then all of the heavenly figures here, and over here on this panel, people going to heaven and people here, unfortunately, rising out of the ground during the call of the Last Judgment and going to hell over here on the far right. This was commissioned in 1443 by Nicholas Roland, the Chancellor to the Duke of Burgundy, and Burgundy was a duchy in part of France, and the Dukes of Burgundy were very, very wealthy and used a lot of their money to create and commission artwork, and so Roland is one of the, right in with the wealthy there. And when he becomes Chancellor, that appointment makes Roland wealthy, and he also creates a hospital for the dying, a Hotel Dieu, or Hospital of God. And this one, like Brenda has said, had similar intentions: provide comfort and remind the dying of their need for faith and to focus on the divine. And like the Isenheim altar, those people that were facing imminent death, they would be placed in their beds where they could view the altarpiece, again, as a hope for a better next life. So the spiritual care of the patients was as important to the treatment of physical ailments. And I think when we think of that today, that's almost a complete inverse of the way we see hospitals today. And you can see the fear in those that are approaching hell. This is less focused on physical ailments, but more on inner torment. And this is something I think Dix will pick up on as well. And like the Isenheim altarpiece, this altarpiece has folds over and would be opened on certain holy days. And so I wanted you to see the exterior of the altarpiece because it contains the donors. We see Mr. Roland over here and his wife and their coats of arms over here. And like the Isenheim interior where it had the Annunciation, we can see it up here. And this painting is done in a form called grisaille, which imitates sculpture. And lo and behold, we have our same two friends, Sebastian and St. Anthony. There's a little pig that tells us it's St. Anthony Abbot here. So again, this altarpiece, while focusing on more less physical ailments, they are still represented in this altarpiece. So when we come to the Isenheim and Grunewald, you can see this format which Brenda really laid out very nicely for us. We see the shrine of St. Anthony, and there's a Last Supper below with Paul and Anthony visiting here, and then the torment of Anthony here, and then the next level where we see the Annunciation right over here, and then the musical choir, and then the Nativity of the Virgin with the baby, and then the risen Christ here, and then the piece that we're also interested in, which is the Christ on the cross. So now we're back to Otto Dix. And so with that kind of reference in the back, we'll take a closer look at Otto's approach, Mr. Dix's approach to his inspiration. So if we think of the Isenheim as altarpiece as a kind of battle for the healing and salvation of individuals in their next life, and by the time they get to this hospital, they're not going to get better. They're going there to die. Most people are, and that's different from us today, where we go to the hospital hoping to get better and come out and resume our life. By the time Dix makes his piece, he's really kind of calling out the futility of war, the loss of life, and the fact that this is a man-made illness. It is not an illness like we're dealing with today. We understand it scientifically, and there's some things that we can do, but for Dix, war is something that can be changed by human beings. So who was this guy? Otto Dix, born 1891 to 1961. And it's important to understand he was a German artist. As Brenda pointed out, that fluid border between Germany and France, Dix was very familiar with these art forms and with the formats of the altarpiece and with the techniques that were used to make it. When he was a young boy, his family moved to Dresden and he attended art school. And I think it's important also to understand that Dix volunteered to serve in World War I. He was a great soldier. He fought in the Battle of the Somme, one of the most horrible battles there, and he earned the Iron Cross. But he was deeply, deeply affected by the war, and he worked as a war correspondent and an artist, and he made several hundred drawings and gouaches and sketches, some of which are very famous, of people with gas masks. After the war, he resumed his art studies, and then it's during this time where he decides he's going to make a living at art, and he devoted himself to the study of old master techniques. And you can see his self-portrait, I'm sorry I didn't label that, here on the right, done in the 1920s, where he is painting on wood, which is really important. And he develops these layers of glazing and trying to get the same effects that an old master would. By 1925, he was a supporter of the new objectivity movement, a new realism that was sweeping most of Europe, but in particular in Germany, depicted the social and political realities of the Weimar Republic. So he begins to move off of a kind of art-centric approach within 5 years to beginning to use art to criticize the political realities of the time. It's important to note that he was so successful, for a while he was able to make a good living as a portrait painter, and we'll see some of that right now. His portraits are really fascinating. They are very realistic. I love this one with the photographer and his dog, two very different expressions and understandings. So he was called upon by many of the upper class to do portrait paintings. He also began, as you can see on the right, to do portraits that were a little less focused on creating an image that people would like. So we see the parents over here in 1921. So some of his portraits are a little unsettling when you first look at them. He's intending to show things the way they are, in the way he understands them to be. And then in the 1920s, and between this period of 1920 to 25, he also takes on what the war has done to people. In 1926, he becomes a professor at the Art Academy in Dresden, but he doesn't last very long. In 1933, when the Nazis come to power, he is dismissed. And the reason for his dismissal was that through his painting, he had committed a quote, violation of the moral sensibilities and subversion of the militant spirit of the German people. So they took it as a direct attack on the political mode of the time. And you may know through some of the Monuments work and the movie and the story about the Monuments men that there were a number of artists during this time whose work was considered in total violation of the Nazi regime and was confiscated, and many of Dix's works were, although he relocated with his family to Lake Constance and took a lot of his work with him. And he was able there to paint and continue his artistic career largely undisturbed from 1935 to 45, but he was not very successful financially, as you might imagine. One historian said that he chose immigration rather than exile. A number of people asked Dix why did he not leave Nazi Germany. And he chose to stay. This was his land and where his work was, and he didn't see the need. In the picture on the right, the scat players from 1920, he uses Dada elements and Cubist elements. You can see he kind of fractures the scene up just a little bit to create a kind of Cubist technique. And Dada is a movement that starts also during the war about the non-sensibilities of the war. It's really an anti-war movement. And he gives us a painting that really indicates his changed feelings after having served in the war. So he focuses on the physical effects that the war had on these veterans. So we see these three veterans. I'll get my cursor here. One which has the Iron Cross, but no legs whatsoever, and missing kind of a plate in the chin, playing cards. This guy has a steel plate in his head and is no hands, but pegs for legs and playing cards with his teeth. This fellow over here also having lots of problems, lost his ear and his eye and part of his mouth, playing with his foot. So a very unsettling piece, kind of done almost in a lighthearted manner, really kind of calling upon the viewer to understand that war takes so much from people, and yet they find ways to continue to be engaged in life and life activities. So there's a sensitivity that develops in Dix that I think is incredibly compassionate. Before painting the war, Dix was creating images that were associated with the war, as we just saw the scat players, but he also was reworking other images as well. So you can see to the left here the image of Van Gogh's cornfield with crows. Dix reinterprets the landscape, and he shows the sun here, kind of an exploding bomb in the center, and then these lines of trees almost reflect lines of soldiers, and the crows often are seen almost as vultures pecking in the ground. So he begins to see much of past history, art history, in this light of what war does to people, to the landscape, and then finally to his great masterpiece, The War, from 1932. It is in a triptych format with the three main panels and the predella. So let's look at how the image progresses across the piece. So right over here, and I tried to highlight it with the arrows, you can see these soldiers kind of marching almost shadow-like in from the fog into the viewer's sight here, and then they turn in this V shape and walk out into the war. We've got a kind of red sky here, almost an eye-like shape. Some people have seen there, and yet the soldiers here, we don't get to identify with them, but we can see their boots and their kit bags with them. The central panel is the most difficult one to look at, I think. It shows us a devastated urban landscape with war weapons and human body parts. No visible whole human being. We see a kind of inner body parts here in the front. We see a figure with a gas mask here, and this is one of the calls of Dix about the devastating effects of gas, and mustard gas was used during the First World War. if we follow some of the other lines and circles, we can see, let me get my cursor working. It's going all over the place here. Here it is. We see some burnt charred wood, which appears here and in this other panel. Those are supposedly references to the cross of the crucifixion. But I think for me, the better reference of the cross of the crucifixion of Grunewald's is this skeletal figure that is up here on this post, pointing with the bony figure to the upside down figure here, which does, there's the head, and then the legs of the figure here, not with the effects of ergotism, but being shot through with bullet holes. So we see the man-made pestilence here kind of creeping in, and the calling out by Dix of the attention to what war has done to bodies, to the trauma to the body. In the right wing, we have a soldier, and this is a self-portrait of Dix right here. We'll see that in a closer detail, who is helping a fallen comrade. Here they've lost all their military gear. They are climbing over a figure here in the blue arrow and another figure here. So they're just trying to get out of the war environment. There's another figure at the bottom with a gas, remnants of a gas mask here. And in the upper right, you see a cloud formation, which is almost like harking back to both altarpieces that we've looked at, the Bayeux and the Isenheim, with this almost winged figure that looks upon the scene, but really can't do anything with it. We are going to look at the predella now in a little more detail. After we look first at the detail up here of Dix carrying the wounded comrade and the expression on his face in greater detail, and you can see the kind of impasto that he's using. He's using much thicker paint and less glazing here as he gets to the important parts of the painting. So the predella, as we saw in the Isenheim Altarpiece, depicts the burial of Christ, and Dix is less clear. There's everything that I could read. There was pros and cons as to whether these were soldiers sleeping in a claustrophobic space or in a kind of trench, or if they were actually dead. However, when we, I think that, to me, that Dix is very clear that these soldiers are dead. He puts them in the predella where we would be dealing with the dead body of Christ. He includes this red tarp, which makes it even more claustrophobic than it already is. And there are injuries to the soldiers. One of them here in the very back, let's see, has lost his shoes. And very often they would take the shoes off dead soldiers to reuse them. So I'm going with the fact that I think the connection here that Dix is making is a connection between the bodies of the fallen soldiers and the body of the martyred Christ. And I think Dix is reaching back to, and I've made this up, I did not find any scholarly research, but in my mind very clearly, if Dix is looking at these layers of art historical works from the past, I think he is not only using the predella as the memory of the martyred Christ, but also as a memento mori, a reminder of the inevitability of death. And one of the most famous memento moris, there's lots in medieval art in the north as well, in Germany. But the one that comes to mind most readily is, for me, is Masaccio's Holy Trinity from 1424. It's a Renaissance fresco masterpiece, and most people know it for the top part of the altarpiece. here, which is the first great use of one-point perspective, Brunelleschi's one-point perspective, which Masaccio was a pupil of Brunelleschi. But at the bottom, you can see here, there is a bier, and we'll look at it in more detail, with a skeleton on it. And this is a memento mori. And you can see the inscription just above the skeleton says, "I was once what you are, and what I am, you will become." And this would have been, could not find the slide I'd had before, but you can see this is right at, a person would be standing right here. So this would be right at eye level for someone to understand. And of course, the memento mori and with the crucifixion of Christ is a reminder to get your life in order before you die, that death is inevitable. So I think for me, Dix brings home the reminder of death in the predella with the additional reference of the memento mori, Masaccio's memento mori, and also of another German artist, Hans Holbein, the body of the dead Christ in the tomb, which we see over here on the right. Otto Dix had seen Holbein, was very familiar with his work, and had seen this work as a young boy. And you can imagine that it would have made, what kind of impression it would have made on a youngster. It's a very realistic depiction of a dead body, and it is believed that Holbein used as a model a man who had died and was removed, and he went to the morgue to do it. There's a lot of discussion about the fact that the eyes are open, as is the mouth, that Christ is still speaking. So Dix is really using this, we'll see in a moment. So we have Masaccio's memento mori, the reality of the very dead body that Holbein is using, and then the reality, as Brenda had pointed out, even again, a third layer of the dead Christ, who bears not only the wounds of the crucifixion, but the indications of the disease of ergotism. And Brenda had pointed out that the predella slides open right at the point of the amputation point on people who had were recovering or dying from ergotism. So Dix reaches back into art history to bring forward a modern condemnation on the realities of fascism and the destruction of war, and he calls it a man-made pestilence. And that got me to thinking, when I started picking up this idea after Brenda and I had talked about what we each were going to do, I began to think, have other artists used a triptych format? And by that I mean this religious format in a call against war, destruction, injustice. And I immediately thought of Picasso's Guernica, done in 1937. Even though it's one piece, it's very large, it's huge, it's a wall-size painting. But he does organize it, for me at least, into a triptych format, where we have the figure coming out of the burning building, and a Pieta, a mother and a dead child, and with the bull here, and then this image of the light bulb and hope, some people think, coming in, and the horse. And then lo and behold, almost in a predella, we see the mutilated body of a soldier. So for me, the Picasso is definitely utilizing this religious format as a call against the war. And Picasso very famously, when he was in France, painting this in France after the bombing, the saturation bombing in Guernica, a Nazi soldier came in, and while he was painting it, and he said, "Did you do this?" The soldier said to Picasso, "Did you do this?" And Picasso said, "No, you did it," meaning the destruction of the war. And even in something like Robert Frank's The Trolley, New Orleans from 1955, a photograph, I see it almost in a triptych format as well, where he uses the windows of the trolley to really focus on segregation in the American South. A very compelling use of this format for me. So in conclusion, Otto Dix, working from firsthand experience in the war and visually referring to past key altarpieces and artwork which addressed healing, salvation, bodily trauma, and human suffering, Dix condemns modern warfare, especially the early use of chemical weapons such as mustard gas, and the terrible toll war has on society and mankind. It is the man-made pestilence. And that's me. I've stopped sharing.
Okay, well, thank you so much to Amy Stewart, who is Professor of Fine Art at Jefferson Community and Technical College, and also to Brenda Edgar, Associate Professor of Fine Art at Jefferson Community and Technical College. And we're so glad to have developed this partnership with JCTC to bring these Humanity Talk series, Being Human, to all of you. So thank you again for joining us wherever you're joining us from, and of course be sure to join us back on Thursday, November 19th for the next series of talks in our series on the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. On Thursday, November 19th at 6:30 p.m. we will have speakers giving talks on the theme of war. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Brenda. And thank you to you at home. And we will look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, be well and stay safe. Thank you.